Have you noticed how often you catch yourself explaining? Not explaining something technical at work, not teaching your kid how to ride a bike, but explaining yourself. Why you didn't answer a text right away. Why you looked tired at the party. Why you chose not to go out last weekend. I was busy. I didn't sleep much. I just needed some time alone. These little explanations spill out almost automatically, like punctuation marks at the end of our sentences. We don't even realize we're doing it. But if you step back for a second and really pay attention, you'll see that this habit, the compulsion to explain yourself, is running in the background of your life more than you think. At first glance, it feels harmless. Polite, even. You think you're just being considerate. You're making sure no one feels offended by your absence, your silence, or your decision. It sounds like empathy, like respect. But let me ask you a harder question. Who are you really serving when you explain yourself over and over again? Are you giving clarity to others, or are you secretly begging for permission to exist? Carl Jung, the Swiss psychologist whose work still shapes the way we understand the human mind, believed that compulsive self-explanation is not about good manners. It's about a wound. A wound so deep that most people never stop to see it. When you constantly justify your emotions, your choices, your moods, what you're really saying is, I'm afraid you'll reject me if I don't explain. Behind that polite tone hides a fear of judgment, abandonment, being misunderstood. And so you try to manage how others see you, hoping that if you give them enough reasons, they'll let you stay in their circle of approval. Think about how this shows up in daily American life. A friend invites you to a barbecue on Saturday and you can't go. Instead of just saying, no, I can't make it, you start listing reasons. My kid's got a soccer game, then I've got errands, and honestly I'm exhausted from work. Why all the detail? Do they need your day planner to accept your no? Or imagine this at work. You log off at 5 on the dot. Instantly, you feel the need to announce, I have to run, I promised my wife I'd pick up dinner tonight. It's not enough to leave. You have to justify leaving. As if your presence in the office only has value if others approve of the way you exit. The truth is uncomfortable. This behavior is not about politeness, it's about survival. Somewhere along the way, you learned that your feelings and actions were not valid unless they could be explained to someone else. Maybe it was in childhood when a teacher told you, stop being so sensitive. Maybe it was when a parent rolled their eyes at your tears and said, oh come on, toughen up. Those moments plant a seed. And that seed grows into a belief, my experience only matters if someone else agrees that it matters. And so, as an adult, you explain. You explain everything. You explain until you're exhausted. And you don't even realize you're living your life like a defendant in a courtroom, always presenting evidence, always pleading your case. But let's pause here. I want you to imagine something. Imagine living one day, just one, without giving explanations. You're late to a meeting, and instead of rushing in with, traffic was insane, and then my kid couldn't find her shoes, and then the dog ran out the door, you simply say, I'm here now. Picture that. Silence instead of excuses. A clear presence instead of a frantic justification. How different would you feel? Here's the kicker, when you explain yourself constantly, you don't just give away your time. You give away your power. You hand over your sense of authority to whoever you're talking to. They become the judge, and you become the defendant. They get to decide if your reason is good enough. They get to determine if your feelings are valid. And if they frown, or shrug, or question you, you start doubting yourself all over again. Tell me, does that sound like freedom? Jung warned about this. He said that when you live for other people's approval, you abandon your own truth. You become an actor in a play you didn't write. The audience claps, and you smile. They boo, and you shrink. But who's really living that life? Not you. It's a version of you edited, trimmed, and dressed up for their approval. The real you is standing backstage, waiting for permission to walk out. So here's the challenge I want to leave with you in this first step. Notice your explanations. Catch them in real time. Tonight, when you say sorry, I'm just tired, stop yourself. Ask, am I tired, or am I trying to explain away my sadness so no one thinks I'm weak? Tomorrow, when you tell a colleague, I can't make the happy hour because I promised my kids, ask, is that true, or could I just say, no, I won't be there? This awareness is the first crack in the invisible prison of explanation. And let me be clear, this is not about arrogance. It's not about being rude or dismissive. It's about reclaiming something that was always yours, the right to live your life without putting it on trial every 5 minutes. You don't owe anyone a dissertation about your emotions. You don't need a permission slip to rest, to leave, to say no, to change your mind. You don't have to convince the world that your choices make sense. Because they make sense to you, and that is enough. So I'll ask you again, how often are you explaining your very existence, and what would happen if you just stopped? Would people think you're selfish? Maybe. Would some pull away because they can't manipulate you anymore? Probably. But would you finally taste what freedom feels like? Absolutely. This is where the journey begins. This is where you stop asking for permission and start living as if you already belong. Because you do. If you really want to understand why so many of us walk around with this constant urge to explain ourselves, you have to go back. Way back. Not to the last argument you had with your boss or the last awkward dinner with your family. You have to go back to where the story actually started, your childhood. Because that's where the wound was planted. And it usually begins in the smallest, most ordinary moments. Picture this. A little boy is crying because he's scared of the dark. His dad walks in and says, "Stop crying. Be a man." Or a little girl is upset because her friend ignored her at school. She runs to her mom, who responds with, "Don't be so dramatic. You're fine." The message is clear, even if it's not spoken outright. Your feelings are too much, too inconvenient, too embarrassing. In that instant, the child learns something dangerous. What I feel only has value if the adults around me approve of it. If they dismiss me, then my inner world doesn't count. And this doesn't just happen once. It happens over and over, in classrooms, on playgrounds, around dinner tables. Maybe your teacher told you to stop daydreaming when you were lost in thought. Maybe your coach yelled at you for showing frustration after a missed shot. Maybe your grandparents brushed off your tears with, "There's nothing to cry about." It all sounds so casual, but it cuts deep. Because when you're a child, you don't have the language to say, "Hey, I'm allowed to feel this." You just internalize the message, if they don't like my emotions, then I better hide them. Or explain them until they finally make sense. That's the seed. And from that seed grows a belief that can dominate your whole life. I don't trust my own feelings. I only trust them if someone else agrees. Think about how heavy that is. Imagine being a child who looks at their own sadness or fear and thinks, "This can't be real unless my parents say it's real." That's like being handed a roadmap but told you can't use it until someone else approves the directions. No wonder so many adults end up feeling lost. Let me bring this closer to everyday American life. You've probably heard phrases like "man up," "don't be so sensitive," or "get over it." They roll off the tongue so easily in our culture that most people don't even question them. But each time a child hears those words, a little piece of trust in their own inner compass breaks. And what fills that space? A survival mechanism, the urge to explain, to justify, to convince. Because if I can explain well enough why I feel this way, maybe they won't dismiss me. Maybe they'll finally understand. Maybe I'll be safe. But here's the thing, safety built on someone else's approval isn't safety at all. It's dependence. It's like building a house on sand. At any moment, if their mood shifts, if their judgment changes, the whole structure collapses. And you're left scrambling, desperately explaining again, just to prove you belong. That's the cycle so many of us carry into adulthood, and it all began when our feelings were treated as optional instead of essential. I want you to pause and ask yourself, can you remember the first time you were told your feelings didn't matter? For some of you, the memory will pop up instantly. Maybe it was your mom brushing you off, or your dad yelling, or a teacher humiliating you in front of the class. For others, it might be harder to pinpoint. But you'll feel it. Somewhere in your body, you'll remember what it was like to swallow your truth and replace it with silence, or with an explanation you hoped would earn you compassion. And this is important to recognize because the habit of explaining doesn't come out of nowhere. It's not just a quirk of personality. It's a defense mechanism. It's a scar tissue built over years of being told, what you feel isn't real unless I say so. That wound doesn't heal on its own. It hides under polite smiles, long apologies, and endless justifications. It hides under the phrase, "I'm fine," when you're not. It hides under every excuse you make for who you are. And until you bring it into the light, it keeps running your life. Let's be real, most families didn't mean to cause this. Parents weren't setting out to destroy your trust in yourself. Teachers weren't plotting to undermine your self-worth. But intention doesn't erase impact. And the impact is massive. Because once that wound is there, the child grows up into an adult who no longer believes their feelings are valid unless they can explain them to someone else. They become an adult who apologizes for existing, who justifies their boundaries, who feels guilty for saying no. That's not freedom, that's conditioning. Jung believed that individuation, the process of becoming your true self, requires facing these old wounds. You can't skip this step. You can't build confidence on top of buried shame. You have to name the place where it started. You have to look back and say, that's when I learned to doubt myself. And when you see it clearly, something shifts. You realize you've been carrying a script that was handed to you decades ago, and it's time to put it down. So here's my invitation for you today. Go back to that moment. Maybe it was in your childhood bedroom. Maybe it was on the basketball court. Maybe it was in the kitchen while you sat at the table and heard, "Stop crying." Wherever it was, I want you to picture it. See yourself there, small, vulnerable, silenced. And now, as the adult you are today, I want you to say to that younger self, your feelings are real. Your truth matters. You don't need to explain yourself to deserve love. That simple act of reparenting yourself, of validating the child inside you, is the beginning of healing. Because once you understand where the wound begins, you stop blaming yourself for the scar. You stop thinking, what's wrong with me that I explained so much, and you start realizing, of course I explain, it was my survival strategy. And survival strategies are powerful, but they're not meant to be permanent. They keep you alive, but they don't let you thrive. Thriving comes when you outgrow the old pattern. And outgrowing it begins with one brave step, acknowledging where it started and choosing, right here and now, that your feelings no longer need anyone else's permission to exist. Let's talk about what happens when that childhood wound grows up with you. Because it doesn't just disappear when you leave home. It shows up in boardrooms, at dinner tables, in marriages, and even in the way you talk to yourself. The habit of explaining becomes the soundtrack of your adult life. And on the surface, it still looks polite. But underneath, it is draining the very core of your freedom. Think about the way you move through your day. You want to leave work a little early because you've already put in your hours. Instead of shutting down your computer and walking out, you start with, "Hey, I just have to pick up the kids, my wife's waiting, traffic's bad. Why can't you just leave?" Or maybe your friend invites you to a concert you don't want to go to. A simple no would be enough. But what comes out of your mouth is, "I'd love to, but I have a deadline, and I'm exhausted, and next week's crazy." You're building an alibi for your own life, as if being tired or uninterested isn't a valid reason on its own. And it gets sneakier. You wake up feeling heavy, sad, not yourself. Someone asks what's wrong. Instead of saying, "I feel sad today," you explain it away. "I'm just tired." Why? Because sadness sounds like weakness. Anger sounds like immaturity. Fear sounds like drama. And so you repackage your truth into something more socially acceptable. That's not just communication. That's self-betrayal. Carl Jung warned us about this. He said that every time you justify your choices to avoid judgment, you are putting your soul on trial. You are literally handing your truth over to someone else and asking them to decide whether it has value. And here's the brutal reality: you may not even notice you're doing it anymore. It's that automatic. Like brushing your teeth or locking your car, it's wired into your system. But while brushing your teeth keeps you healthy, explaining yourself keeps you small. Let me give you a picture. Imagine your life as a theater. Every day, you walk out onto the stage. But the script in your hand isn't yours. It's written by the people you're trying to please. The audience, your boss, your partner, your friends, society itself, has the power. They clap, you smile. They frown, you adjust. You're not the author of your life. You're the actor begging for applause. And that applause, let's be honest, never lasts long enough. The second it fades, you're scrambling again, trying to explain, justify, convince. Now here's the cost. When you live this way, you slowly lose connection with your own inner compass. You don't make decisions because they feel right. You make decisions because they sound explainable. You don't express emotions because they're true. You translate them into something safer. You don't live for yourself. You perform for others. And little by little, you forget what you actually want, what you actually feel, who you actually are. This isn't just inconvenient. It's dangerous. Because the longer you ignore your truth, the louder your body and mind will scream. Anxiety creeps in. Depression sinks its claws. You feel exhausted, not from hard work, but from constantly editing yourself for other people's comfort. You second-guess everything: your relationships, your career, your worth. Why? Because you've traded inner authority for external validation. You've outsourced your sense of self to the opinions of others. And here's the tragedy: society rewards it. People call you easygoing, agreeable, professional. They praise you for being someone who gets along, someone who doesn't cause trouble. But behind those compliments lies a person who is quietly suffocating. You've become the dependable one, the reasonable one, the one who always has a good explanation. And yet inside, you are exhausted, because every explanation is another little death. Another moment where you abandoned yourself to keep the peace. So let me ask you, whose life are you living? When you say yes while your whole body screams no, who are you really serving? When you laugh at a joke you don't find funny, just to avoid being called uptight, who benefits? When you disguise anger as logic, sadness as fatigue, fear as stress, what happens to the real you? I'll tell you what happens. The real you goes silent. And silence inside breeds emptiness. That emptiness is why so many people feel lost even when their lives look perfect on paper. But let's be clear. This isn't about cutting off explanations entirely, forever. It's not about becoming cold or selfish. It's about recognizing the price you pay when explaining becomes your default survival tool. Because that price is steep. You lose authenticity. You lose clarity. You lose trust in yourself. And in exchange, you get temporary approval. Approval that vanishes the moment someone else's expectations change. That's not a fair trade. Jung called this state a disconnection from the self. The ego, the part of you that interacts with the world, becomes a servant of other people's approval. It bends, reshapes, edits itself, not to reflect your inner truth, but to match what the outside world wants to see. And in that constant adaptation, you drift further and further from your center. You stop listening to your intuition. You stop believing your own feelings. You start doubting your deepest desires. Until one day, you look in the mirror and wonder, who am I really? That's the price of constant justification. It's not just exhaustion, it's identity theft. But here's the good news: once you see the cost, you can stop paying it. You can decide that your feelings are valid simply because they are yours. You can choose to say no without a 3-point PowerPoint. You can let your sadness stand without disguising it. And in that choice, you begin to reclaim something priceless, your internal authority. So the question is simple but life-changing: are you willing to stop living for the audience? Are you willing to stop being an actor in someone else's play and start writing your own script? Because every time you explain yourself when no explanation is needed, you sell a piece of your soul. And every time you choose silence instead, you buy it back. So what's the way out of this endless cycle of explaining? How do you move from living like an actor waiting for approval to living like the author of your own story? This is where Carl Jung drops the key that changes everything. He called it individuation, the process of becoming fully yourself. And at the center of that process is something most of us were never taught to cultivate: internal authority. Let's break that down. Internal authority is not arrogance. It's not stubbornness. It's not walking into every room with a chip on your shoulder. Internal authority is the quiet, grounded conviction that your feelings, your choices, your perspective are valid because they are yours. Not because they were approved. Not because they were explained. Simply because they are true to you. Imagine that for a moment. Imagine what your life would look like if you stopped waiting for others to validate your emotions. How much time, energy, and dignity would you reclaim? Jung believed that without this inner authority, you're always living from the outside in. You act, then you look around to see if people clap. You decide, then you scramble to justify it so no one gets upset. That's the old way. The path of individuation flips it. It's about living from the inside out. Feeling, deciding, and then holding that truth whether people like it or not. That doesn't mean ignoring others. It means no longer outsourcing your sense of worth to them. Think about the moments in life where you've tasted this, even briefly. Maybe it was the first time you said no to something you didn't want to do and you didn't explain it. You didn't list reasons, you didn't justify. You just said no. And maybe the silence after that felt uncomfortable. Maybe your body wanted to rush in with excuses. But you didn't. And in that moment, you felt something new: strength. Not loud strength, not aggressive strength. Quiet, undeniable strength. That's the power of internal authority. Let me give you an everyday example. A coworker asks you to take on a project. Old you says, "I'd love to, but I already have this, and this, and this, and I promised to help with that, and I'm exhausted." Internal authority you simply says, "I can't take that on." And you stop there. No explanation. No justification. No apology. Do you see how different that feels? One version is begging to be excused. The other is calmly stating the truth. That's the shift Jung was pointing to. The shift from begging for permission to declaring existence. Here's another image. Think of your psyche like a house. Without internal authority, the front door is wide open, and anyone can walk in, rearrange the furniture, tell you how to decorate, and leave you to clean up the mess. With internal authority, the door is still open for connection, but it has a frame, it has boundaries, and it has a lock you control. People can visit, but they don't get to redesign the place. Because you know who you are and what belongs inside. Now, let's be honest, building this authority isn't easy. It's not a switch you flip. It's a practice. And like any practice, it starts small. The first step is awareness, catching yourself in the act of over-explaining. The second step is experimenting with silence. Try it. When someone asks why you don't want dessert, resist the urge to launch into health reasons or diets or schedules. Just say, "No thanks." Feel the discomfort. Notice how your body wants to fill the silence. And then breathe. Let the silence stand. Because every time you do, you're strengthening that inner muscle of authority. And yes, it will feel scary at first. Jung said individuation requires what he called the desert of inner solitude. That's the phase where you learn to hold your truth without rushing to soften it for others. It's the moment when you say no and don't explain. When you change your mind and don't justify. When you end a conversation without apologizing. Not because you don't care, but because you finally realized you don't owe anyone an explanation for existing. That desert feels lonely at first, but it's also where you discover who you are when you're not performing. Now, here's what's beautiful. Internal authority doesn't make you cold. It doesn't cut you off from people. In fact, it does the opposite. Once you no longer need to beg for understanding, your communication becomes more authentic. You're no longer speaking to convince, you're speaking to connect. You're no longer apologizing for your truth, you're offering it as a gift. You don't say yes to avoid rejection, you say yes because you genuinely want to. And that shift makes your presence magnetic. People can feel when someone is rooted in themselves. It commands respect without force. It attracts trust without explanation. This is why Jung called internal authority a central piece of individuation. It's not about becoming selfish. It's about becoming whole. It's about recognizing that your emotions, no matter how contradictory or confusing they seem, don't need to be put on trial. They're valid the moment they arise. And once you stop fighting them, once you stop repackaging them for other people, you gain access to something most people never find: real freedom. The kind that isn't borrowed, isn't conditional, isn't fragile. Freedom that starts within and radiates outward. So here's my challenge to you. Over the next week, pick one moment where you usually explain yourself. It could be turning down an invitation. It could be leaving work on time. It could be saying no to a favor. And when that moment comes, do it without the explanation. Feel the fear rise. Feel the urge to justify. And then resist. Let silence hold the space where your excuses used to go. That silence is not emptiness. That silence is power. That silence is the beginning of internal authority. Jung was right. This is the turning point. This is the shift from living under the weight of everyone else's expectations to living in alignment with your own truth. And once you taste it, you'll never want to go back. Because once you discover that you never needed permission to be yourself, you finally understand what freedom really means. Now let's talk about one of the most underestimated forces you have at your disposal: silence. Not the awkward silence that makes you fidget in a conversation. Not the passive silence that comes from fear. I'm talking about a different kind of silence. The kind that grows out of internal authority. The kind that says, without words, I don't owe you an explanation. Jung understood this power long before our culture ever did. He saw silence not as absence, but as presence. And if you've ever tried it, you know it feels like a revolution. Picture this. You're in a conversation where someone expects you to justify yourself. Maybe it's your partner pressing you with "Why are you upset?" Maybe it's your boss asking why you left on time. Maybe it's a friend pushing you to explain why you don't want to go out. The old you would jump in with details, excuses, long-winded stories. The new you, the you rooted in internal authority, just lets silence sit. You say less. You hold your ground. And suddenly the entire dynamic changes. Because manipulation only works if you react. When you stop reacting, the game ends. Silence in this context is not withdrawal. It's not shutting down. It's a statement. A firm, unshakable statement that your truth doesn't need defending. That your no doesn't need a supporting PowerPoint. That your sadness doesn't need to be disguised as tiredness. Silence creates a boundary. It's like building a wall out of stone, solid, immovable, and completely your own. And here's what makes it so powerful: people can't climb it the way they can climb over excuses. Excuses invite debate. Explanations invite criticism. But silence? Silence ends the conversation without raising your voice. Have you ever noticed how uncomfortable silence makes people who rely on your compliance? Think about the coworker who's used to you justifying every move. When you stop explaining, they don't know what to do. Think about the family member who always presses you for reasons. When you simply say no and leave it there, they squirm. Why? Because your silence removes the leverage they've always used, your insecurity. Without that, they lose control. And that can feel threatening to them. Which is exactly why silence is such a filter. It reveals who's in your life because they truly care for you, and who's there because they could manipulate you. This is what Jung meant when he said individuation often requires rupture. Some relationships simply won't survive your silence. But let's be clear, that's not a tragedy. That's a gift. Because the ones who fall away were never there for your truth. They were there for the version of you that was easy to control. And when that version disappears, so do they. Painful? Yes. Necessary? Absolutely. Because what remains are the relationships built on respect, not fear. On honesty, not performance. But let's not romanticize it. Silence isn't easy. The first time you try it, you'll feel your whole body scream to fill the space. You'll want to soften your no. You'll want to justify your decision. You'll want to explain your feelings so people don't misinterpret them. That's the old survival strategy fighting for its life. And in those moments, silence becomes more than a social tool, it becomes a spiritual practice. It's the practice of staying whole in the face of discomfort. It's the training ground where you prove to yourself that you can endure being misunderstood and still remain intact. And that endurance is the real power. Because once you realize you can survive not being understood, you stop living as a prisoner of other people's opinions. That's freedom. That's why silence is magnetic. When someone meets a person who no longer explains themselves, they feel something different. They feel a presence that doesn't beg, doesn't perform, doesn't bend. And that presence commands respect. It shifts the energy in a room. It makes people pay attention. Not because you demanded it, but because you embody it. Here's an everyday example. Imagine a heated discussion with a family member. They're fishing for a reaction, waiting for you to justify yourself so they can argue with your reasons. Instead, you stay calm. You don't argue. You don't explain. You simply say, "That doesn't work for me," and then let the silence stretch. Watch what happens. The dynamic collapses. The argument runs out of fuel. You didn't win by fighting louder. You won by refusing to play the game. That's the genius of silence. It's resistance without aggression, clarity without chaos. And silence doesn't just transform your relationships. It transforms you. Because when you stop wasting energy on constant explanations, you start listening inward. You notice feelings you used to shove aside. You give yourself permission to actually feel instead of rationalize. You rediscover the voice that was buried under years of justification. And that internal listening becomes the foundation for your external authority. Silence clears the static so you can finally hear yourself again. So let me ask you this, where in your life are you still explaining when silence would serve you better? Maybe it's with your boss, who doesn't need to know the details of why you're unavailable. Maybe it's with a partner, who doesn't need a manual to understand your boundaries. Maybe it's with yourself, where you keep rationalizing decisions you don't actually want. What would happen if, just once, you stopped talking and let silence do the heavy lifting? Here's the truth. Silence is an absence. Silence is presence. Silence is saying, "I don't need to prove myself." Silence is the invisible line that tells the world, "I know who I am, and I don't need you to validate it." And the longer you practice this, the stronger it gets. At first it feels shaky. Then it feels steady. And eventually, it becomes unshakable. The kind of authority you don't have to announce because everyone around you can feel it. That's the power of silence. It's the moment you stop defending your life and start living it. It's the shift from being reactive to being rooted. And once you taste it, you'll never go back. Because once you've discovered that silence protects your truth better than 1,000 explanations ever could, you'll realize you don't just have a voice, you have presence. And presence, my friends, is the kind of power no one can take away. So we've walked through the wound, the habit, the cost, and the shift. Now let's bring it all together, because the end goal isn't just to stop explaining yourself. The end goal is to live with integrity. And when I say integrity, I don't mean the stiff, moralistic version you hear in corporate seminars. I mean psychological integrity, the wholeness of knowing who you are, honoring it without apology, and carrying it into every corner of your life. Think about it this way. Integrity is when the inside matches the outside. What you feel lines up with what you say. What you want lines up with what you do. There are no hidden translations, no explanations to soften the edges, no disguises to make your truth more palatable. Integrity is coherence. And coherence is power. Because when you are whole, you stop leaking energy into justifications. You stop twisting yourself into knots to be understood. You stop betraying yourself in the name of being accepted. Jung saw this as one of the highest expressions of individuation. He said that the integrated person doesn't beg to be understood. They communicate, yes, but they don't convince. Why? Because they're not operating from a place of insecurity. Their words don't come from a hidden fear of rejection, they come from a solid center. You can feel it when you meet someone like this. Their presence is steady, grounded. They don't push. They don't perform. They don't over-explain. And yet they command respect. Now here's the paradox. The less you ask for approval, the more respect you evoke. People unconsciously sense when someone is whole. They sense when someone has drawn that invisible line, I don't need to negotiate my existence. And because of that, they treat you differently. The colleague who used to dump work on you thinks twice. The friend who used to guilt trip you stops trying. The partner who leaned on manipulation realizes the dynamic has changed. Not because you screamed, not because you fought, but because your integrity shifted the entire atmosphere. And integrity doesn't mean rigidity. It doesn't mean never changing your mind. In fact, integrity gives you more flexibility, not less. Because when you know who you are, you don't fear being wrong. You don't fear disappointing others. You trust your own internal compass enough to pivot when you need to. That's the beauty of living whole, you can move without losing yourself. Let's bring it down to daily life. Imagine you're at work, and your manager pressures you to take on an extra project. Old you would explain why you can't, listing every reason, hoping they'd see your side. Integrated you simply says, that doesn't work for me. No drama. No guilt. Just truth. Or imagine you're at a family gathering and someone makes a comment that crosses your boundary. Old you would laugh it off, maybe even explain why it hurt, trying to smooth it over. Integrated you calmly says, that's not okay, and lets the silence do the rest. That's integrity in action. It's not aggressive. It's aligned. And here's the deeper payoff. When you stop betraying yourself, your anxiety drops. That background hum of stress that comes from constantly editing yourself, it fades. Decision-making becomes easier because you're no longer calculating how to justify each choice. Your relationships become clearer because you see who respects you for you and who only stayed because you were easy to control. You stop living to be understood and start living to be true. That shift alone can change the entire trajectory of your life. But the greatest transformation isn't even external, it's internal. Because when you live with integrity, you start to emanate a new energy. People feel it before you even speak. It's the energy of someone who is no longer negotiating their worth. Someone who walks into a room not asking, do I belong here, but declaring, I already belong. That kind of energy is magnetic. It changes the way people treat you, but more importantly, it changes the way you treat yourself. So let me ask you right now, what's the explanation you've been giving over and over that you're finally ready to stop? Maybe it's the one you give for your emotions, I'm just tired. Maybe it's the one you give for your boundaries, I would, but I'm too busy. Maybe it's the one you give for your way of being, that's just how I was raised. Which one are you ready to drop? Write it down. Say it out loud. Because naming it is the first step to releasing it. Here's the truth, the world will always try to make you explain yourself. Culture, family, work, they'll all want reasons, justifications, stories. And sometimes, giving them will be part of healthy communication. But when it becomes compulsive, when it becomes survival, it's no longer communication, it's self-betrayal. That's where the line is. And that's where integrity steps in. Jung wasn't just talking theory. He was pointing to a lived reality. Wholeness is possible. Freedom is possible. But you can't reach it by begging for permission. You reach it by building internal authority, by practicing silence, and by living with integrity. And when you do, everything changes. You stop being a character in someone else's story and you finally become the author of your own. So here's my final challenge to you: stop negotiating your existence. Stop explaining your truth into smaller, safer pieces. Stop betraying yourself to keep the peace. Integrity isn't about pleasing everyone. It's about being whole, even if it means disappointing others. And the moment you step into that wholeness, you'll realize something life-changing: you never needed their permission in the first place. You were always enough. That's the life you were meant to live. Not explained. Not justified. Whole. Thank you for staying with me until the end of this journey. I know your time is valuable. If this message spoke to you, if it gave you even one moment of clarity or peace, I'd be grateful if you'd let me know. A simple like, a comment with your thoughts, or subscribing to the channel helps this community grow, and it helps more people who might need these words to find them. Share your reflections below. I do read them. I'll see you in the next chapter. Until then, take care of your peace.